Where does India stand? What do we need to do as a nation? And what should be our strategy going ahead? We have three special guests on the show. Joining us this evening, Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar, Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defence Staff, Medical Wing under the Chief of Defence Staff, joining us live from Delhi. Thank you, General Kanitkar, for joining us on the show this evening. Professor Manindra Agarwal, Professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering and the Deputy Director of the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. And Professor Vidyasagar, Chief of the Government Experts Panel, Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology in Hyderabad, joining us on the show. Let me start by first asking Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar on where we stand today. I spoke to you, in fact, you spoke to Republic TV a few weeks back, General Kanitkar, and you spoke about our battle. And back then when we discussed India's battle against COVID-19, we were in the middle of bringing key medical aid from different parts of the country. You spoke about the armed services and the contribution. Now, what is your analysis of where we stand today and what we need to do?
Yeah, thank you, Niranjan, for inviting me to join you all on this panel today. But last time I spoke as Integrated Defence Staff Deputy Chief DCIDS Medical. But today I speak as a scientist who's been working more of voluntary this with Professor Manindra and Professor Vidyasagar. And I think we are reasonably, if I bring that what we did to the Kojit war, we are doing reasonably well. We've been able to help out people in most places. The armed forces has helped out and the numbers are coming down. The pressure on our hospitals is lesser. And I think from here, it's going to be a much smoother ride and people should be reassured that probably we are seeing the light at the end of this tunnel. Yeah.
Okay. Let me come straight to the point. Now, there is a model that we've all been looking at very closely, the Sutra model. And Professor Manindra Agarwal perhaps can talk about it. We've been speaking about it with Professor Vidyasagar for the last few days. Now, where do we stand today as far as India's COVID curve goes, Professor Agarwal?
Yeah, well, it's dropping very sharply as the numbers indicate. From a peak of 4 lakh plus infections on 6th of May. We are today touching about 2.5 lakhs, which is within 2 weeks of time. It's a very significant drop. This was also predicted by our model. And what we expect is that by end of this month, this number should further drop to 1.5 lakhs or even 7. So that means we are certainly on the way down, but also that doesn't mean that one should lower the guard. In absolute terms, even 2.5 lakhs a day is a significantly large number. So we have to be careful. We have to be take necessary precautions. But the good news is that better days are ahead.
And we've been looking at some of those numbers. We'll play out those graphs as well of the Sutra model. Professor Vidyasagar, now, specifically talking about this model and the kind of graph that we've seen, some of the projected numbers and the actual COVID graph witnessed across India and also in the different states. Now, what are some of the limitations and what are some of the trends that you're spotting? Let's start by looking at some of the limitations of this model.
So I think the main limitation of any model is the quality of the input.
Yeah, just lost your audio there. Getting your video. Okay.
Yeah, I was not quite sure.
Yeah.
Is the audio back now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I was saying was that the quality of the data that goes into the model is actually the biggest limitation. See, the data that we put into the model is a crowdsourced model. So consequently, there are always going to be a lot of small localized errors. And by and large, we expect that all these small errors will cancel themselves out. That's the main limitation we have. The second limitation I would say is the absence of fine-grained data. So for example, General Kanitkar can point out that this time the pandemic seems to be hitting younger people much more severely than in the first case. So, for example, what is the age profile of these patients? What is the age profile of the deaths? How does it compare with the corresponding profile in the first wave? So if you had all this kind of information, then we would be able to do a far better job. At the moment, we just have only a very aggregated number on the total number of cases and total number of recovered people, things like that. So those, I would say, are the two main limitations.
Okay.
There are other small limitations, but I won't go into them now.
Okay. Now, let me go straight to Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar on a point that you made, Professor Vidyasagar, of the concern with children. We've been discussing it in great detail. Many medical experts have also spoken about it. You're a top scientists and researchers also raising an alarm. Now, General Kanitkar, is a third wave inevitable? And if so, what do your studies show? Is there a gap between the second and a possible third wave?
See, when we were doing this modeling, which Professor Vidyasagar very correctly brought out, the biggest limitation was actual real-time data on zero prevalence or zero positivity. So the model is at best a mathematical equation. You know, there have been top scientists who put mathematical equations to get a trend and translate it into what is happening on ground. But when you see the human body and the human behavior, they are very, very diverse. And in that, we are not really accounting into what is the percentage which is being vaccinated, what is the percentage which is really immune, what is happening to the antibodies over a period of time. So we take the entire population as susceptible. So in your Sutra model, we took as susceptible, undetected, which were till your testing was not, really ramped up. We were having a large number of undetected cases, and our model predicted that it could be as much as 70 times for every detected case. But as the testing has ramped up, we are picking up more cases. We feel it's nearer, maybe 30, 35 now. So these are a lot of variables, and these are mathematical equations. So they need to be repeatedly calibrated with real time. And I'm sure in the times to come, if we can put that together, we could be a little more confident. And a mathematical model, since this model has not looked at age differentiation, cannot say with confidence that yes, the children will be ahead. These are conjectures which the scientific community is feeling, because we've seen a different age group which is being vaccinated. And if we continue to vaccinate those above 18 years, we would have a pool of people who are below that who become a large part of the susceptible population because we've not vaccinated them. We've also seen that almost more than a year, the children have been away from school. So we are looking at just that aspect. So this is where our concerns are. We can't say it will happen, but these are our concerns, and we would need data to put that into the mathematical model.
Professor Manindra Agarwal, a point that I picked up from what General Kanitkar said was about the erosion of immunity, right? So when does immunity erode? No, and what was the concern with the second wave? No, if I heard you carefully, and from some of the points that I'm picking up, it meant that the second wave was almost like a fresh wave, which meant that the entire Indian population was susceptible to an almost new disease altogether.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's estimated that the immunity starts wearing off after 3 months of getting infected. And by 7-8 months, it's gone in nearly everyone. So once we look at that kind of a time period, and we just look at the gap between first and second wave, it does translate to basically saying that just before the second wave started, practically everybody had lost immunity, and so it was like a fresh wave on the entire population.
Yeah. And taking that point forward ahead of a possible third wave. Now, I'm sorry to repeat that again and again, but now we're assuming that there could be a third wave. Now, let's look at what we can do as a population and what we need to do, Professor Vidyasagar. If you look at vaccination, which seems to be the only option ahead of us, what should be the, formula to be prepared for a third wave? Vaccination formula. How many people do we need to vaccinate?
Well, there's a difference between what is feasible and what is desirable. Obviously, if you could vaccinate everybody within the next 8 months with 2 doses, then we would pretty much stop the third wave in its tracks. But if you just look at the numbers, even with the best scenarios, I don't know if we will have enough vaccine doses to vaccinate everybody with 2 doses. So what we as a modeling team need to do is to analyze various possible scenarios. As Professor Agrawal pointed out, if we had good studies on the way in which antibodies erode in the population, that would help us a lot in planning properly. So for example, if you give 1 dose of a vaccine, how long do these antibodies last to a satisfactory level? If they last, of course, the recommendations may be get a booster in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, but that is not the same as saying that after 8 weeks you're defenseless. It doesn't mean that at all. So if you had an actual study on the duration for which vaccination affords protection to the vaccinated individual, then we can make a sensible prediction about whether you should, for example, give 1 dose to everybody as soon as possible and then backfill, or you give 2 doses to everybody who is vulnerable, like say the 60 and above, and then backfill. So there are all these possible scenarios, and we, as the creator of the Sutra model, can actually simulate all these possible scenarios pretty accurately. But in order to be able to do that, we need to understand reasonably accurately how the antibodies actually erode, both in the people who have been infected and have natural antibodies, as well as the people who have been vaccinated.
Okay, Lieutenant General Kanitkar, if I have to go by what Professor Vidyasagar just said, you would have to vaccinate at least 50 crore people, slightly more than half of our adult population, and that would mean 100 crore doses to be administered, because you will have to vaccinate 50 crore people over the next possibly 8 months, or about 12 to 13 crore doses a month, right? Now, it's mind-boggling, and the reason I'm making this point is because in the last few days we've seen a trend of the daily vaccinations hover around the 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 million mark. Now, that is a cause of concern, but we're hoping that it picks up in the next couple of months. By August, we are being told that there will be many more crore doses of vaccination available. Now, going by your own mathematical model, now, before the end of December, if we've vaccinated everyone, including kids, right? I don't know whether the trials for kids' vaccines will be approved, but let's assume that the entire population is vaccinated. Would that be the ideal case scenario?
I can put it in a very simplistic term, what we are trying to do in this model. So suppose you had a container, a little matka, which had a flowing in water, and there was a small hole from which that water was flowing out. And if you had that entire water which could get infected potentially, that is the susceptible population. Now, the moment you vaccinate them, or they have had infection and get antibodies, this water level goes out because that is flowing out from the pool to that little opening that I explained. But at the same time, when the antibodies start waning because of either a natural infection, we are still not sure how long the vaccine is going to be effective. The antibody titers are going to be protective. We also, in the future, as of now, all the mutants, various research has shown that they are still susceptible, and the vaccines which we have today are protecting against those mutations. But we cannot find that out and we fine-tune it for the future unless we have this
rate at which the water flowed kept filling into the container. That is the rate at which these people were becoming susceptible again, and the rate at which the people were moving out either because of a natural infection or because of vaccination. If we can achieve that they move out faster than they are coming in, that is where, and when we say herd immunity, we say yes, about 60% if you've had, you're getting a fair amount of a good control. So this is a very simplistic way that we are trying to get these equations. And if we can get this data through studies, which shows the rate at which the people are moving out of being susceptible and the rate at which we are vaccinating. As far as your vaccination, what you mentioned, I am pretty certain the rates will go up because of lockdowns, because of illness, because of bereavement. We've been through a difficult time, but I think most of us have realized the value. And in my last meeting with you on Republic, I had shown how effective the vaccination has been for the armed forces.
Yeah.
We've been able to vaccinate 96%. And look, in this second wave, we've had such an amazing, including the asymptomatic secondary case rates have been lower. People who've got infection have been mild, and there have been very minimal deaths, and that too majority, like 2 really who actually had no other comorbidity. The others were because of either a renal transplant or some other comorbidity. So that's been the effectiveness of the vaccination, and I think that should be our first thing, to get as many as we could. Ideal is, yes, we get everyone vaccinated, but if not, at least the most susceptible ones. And I think the government's policy of, changing, going down to lower ages, we are looking at that. And along with that is continuing to maintain vigilance of wearing the mask, keeping our distance, avoiding crowded spaces, like we've seen now that the virus may have an aerosol thing. So instead of being scared, we avoid super spreader events like closed spaces with poor ventilation. These are the places where people get more susceptible. So I think both increasing the vaccination and ramping up our personal protection, and the third is most important is really taking this wake-up call and ramping up our basic healthcare infrastructure so we don't get overwhelmed. I think if we follow this three-pronged attack, I think we can take on any wave that comes our way.
Yeah. Well, that's of course our only option. Professor Agrawal, one thing that we are really struggling with, and we have our team of reporters, reporting from the hinterland, from the corners of India where the media usually doesn't go. For example, the tribals in Odisha, a tribal belt, and they don't know what COVID is all about. They don't know the concept of masking, but COVID has reached these corners, right? Now, you all are experts, you speak to the government. Now, how do you deal with COVID in rural India? Is there a formula of what should be done? And of course, we saw that the government and the Prime Minister engaging district officials, because that's eventually it comes down to that, dealing with it at a district level. But as a country, we've learned a lot in this pandemic. Now, what do the experts tell the government? What is the effective way of dealing with COVID in rural India?
Actually, I would defer this question to General Kanetkar, because I'm not a real expert in this area. I'm just a modeler. I just want to make two small corrections in your display. One is about the plots you're showing.
Yeah.
The orange curve is the projected infection and blue curve is the actual infection.
Right.
What is being displayed is the other way around.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll get that correct. We'll get that corrected. Okay. Okay, we'll get that corrected.
The second is that I'm no longer Deputy Director at IIT Kanpur. I was, but not.
Okay, apologies for that as well. Okay, now I wanted to talk about the possibility of this highly infectious variant that we're all discussing, Professor Vidyasagar. Now, what were the factors that precipitated the second wave? Now, tell us a little bit about the variants, because everyone's talking about it. Everyone wants to know, because you have no option. Just before the show started, we spoke about how the UK was thinking of a booster dose. Now, Indian vaccine makers are also looking at it. Vaccination this year, yes, that's an option, but as the variants get more dangerous, right, you will have to keep innovating. Technology will have to keep changing. So how do you deal with a situation like that?
So I did see the segment right before our show where you were talking to you were showing the UK Prime Minister, Mr. Boris Johnson, talking to the public. So in terms of the variant, I would say the following. The calculations we have done on what was called the contact rate showed that compared with the first wave, in the second wave, this contact rate, a parameter called beta, increased by a factor of about 1.5 to 1.6. So you can say approximately a 60% increase. So this 60% increase encompasses a variety of factors. It, of course, encompasses the increased transmissibility of variants, not merely the 617, but B.1.17, which is the so-called UK variant, 117, I believe. Anyway, so there's the so-called UK variant and the Indian one, and also in a few spots we presumably have seen the South African variant. So the accumulated effect of all these variants is another factor, but the fact that people have abandoned social distancing and good practices of corona, that is yet a third factor. So from whatever few data points I'm able to get, it looks like the transmissibility of the new virus variant contributes not more than about 20-25% to the increase in the contact rate. So the remaining 30-35% comes from the fact that people haven't been following COVID guidelines and they have not been avoiding events, things of this nature. So even with the new variants, if people were to continue following the COVID guidelines, then the rate of increase of the new variant, if any, would be somewhat lower and therefore much more manageable. And this is the point that General Kanitkar was also saying in a slightly different language, namely that the vaccination is not a license for everybody to abandon all common sense and get back to complete the neglect of COVID protocols. So even if there are variants, if people actually go back to good COVID practices, which certainly they did not do in the January, February timeframe, we all know that, then things would begin to look a lot better. And the reason why cases are declining now is because at the moment, there are not enough susceptible people to feed the pandemic. But as time goes on, some of these people will lose their immunities and get back to being susceptible. And that's when the pandemic would grow again. I hope I have answered your question.
Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar, Professor Manindra Agarwal and Professor Vidyasagar, thank you for your time and thank you for speaking to Republic TV this evening.